Good afternoon. My name is Whitney Aaron Basil, and on behalf of the entire Theorizing the Web Organizing Committee, I'd like to welcome you to today's episode of Theorizing the Web Presents, Networking in the Anthropocene. Theorizing the Web Presents is our series of talks about technology and society. New episodes stream live every other Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are 2 episodes left after this one. If you'd like to discuss today's episode as it happens, or submit questions for Q&A, please join us in the TTW Discord. You can find the Discord back channel by following the link in the description of this YouTube video and on our website, theorizingtheweb.org. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the production team at the Museum of the Moving Image, without whom Theorizing the Web Presents truly would not be possible. I'd also like to thank my fellow organizing committee members, as well as all 3 of today's panelists. And on behalf of all of us, we'd like to thank you for watching and participating. If you'd like to taste stock and would like to see more, please consider making a donation to both Theorizing the Web and Museum of the Moving Image. Every donation helps us to produce content like this, and we're grateful that we can do that with you. And with that, I will turn it over to today's moderator, Dr. Tanya Lokot. Tanya is an assistant professor at the School of Communications, Dublin City University. Her research and writing focus on the interplay between digital media and civic actors in the context of augmented protest. She also writes about internet freedom, censorship, and internet governance in Ukraine and Russia. Thank you, Tanya.
Thanks, Whitney. So today's episode, titled Networking in the Anthropocene, considers the complex role of human agency in our relationships with network technologies. And Anthropocene is a buzzword, which we usually use to denote the current geological but also cultural age, viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. For our speakers today, this focus also extends beyond the implications of climate change for the future of digital media to also a critique of the human-centered social web, where the user-centric approach also poses issues for our online experience and our offline lives. So without further ado, I'm going to start by introducing our first presenter, Melanie Bumpas. Melanie has a background in tech policy, qualitative research, and social theory, and she completed a Master of Science degree at the Oxford Internet Institute in 2017. Originally from Mississippi, she spent several years living in China and is currently based in Washington, D.C. She's particularly interested in the politics of how socio-technical systems are designed and deployed. Melanie, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. Let me share my screen. Can you see that? Great. So hi, everybody. I am super excited to be here. Really grateful to Theorizing the Web and Museum of the Moving Image for all the work they've put in. It's really cool to be able to share something like this today, and I can't wait to hear what you all think of the stuff I've been working on. So my talk today is called Abolish the User, Designing Against the End of History. I do want to note before I get started that this is not a research presentation, but rather kind of an attempt to set up a lens or a framework that I've been trying to develop for looking at social media. I'm still reading and exploring and even trying to experiment some of my own, but I don't know what I don't know. So please feel free to mention anything relevant that comes to mind. And with that being said, let me just dive right in. So in the broadest possible terms, what I'm interested in is the relationship between digital technology, particularly social platforms on one hand, and people on the other. And part of the way I want to do that is to kind of problematize both sides of that equation, so both people and platforms. One of the most useful ways I found of doing this is by looking at platforms as socio-technical systems. That is, the technical and the social influence each other in intricate ways to form something that we can still look at as a single historically located entity. Facebook, for example, is more than just a website or a company. It's also literally made out of the cultural and social histories brought to the table by all of the people who are employed to build it and all the people who use it. And of course, Facebook as a socio-technical system is also the new bits of culture that users produce together after they log on. which are in turn influenced by the technical affordances of the underlying hardware and software. I've tried to illustrate this here with a picture of plants growing on a trellis. So you can imagine the vines and the wooden latticework as though they're mutually shaping each other in ways that are influenced by their respective histories. I'm particularly interested in what Bernard Stiegler describes as the technics of how individuals themselves are shaped by the tools they use, in this case, social platforms. So keeping this view in mind, let's turn to the social platforms we actually have in real life. So I think this slide pretty much captures the way many of us view social platforms in 2020. They're inescapable facts of life, and they also deeply suck, both in the popular mind and in academia. A lot of this stems from concern over the algorithm, particularly insofar as it might be exacerbating political polarization or amplifying toxic or extremist elements. Other things we love to hate about platforms include invasive advertising, surveillance capitalism, clickbait, the attention economy, so-called fake news, Russian bots, rampant racism and misogyny. So I'm not disputing that all of those problems exist or that platforms are deeply shaped from head to toe by things like nationalism and late capitalist extraction. To the contrary, what I want to argue is that if we want to truly understand these problems, we have to look even deeper. So this is a little bit of a detour, but what I want to get into is that those critiques of social media don't really go back far enough. They don't dig deep enough. I want to unpack one of the biggest unstated assumptions built into platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And this is something that those platforms have in common with modern conceptions of the nation state and with market capitalism. Specifically, it's the way that they think about and operationalize what it means to be a person. So going back at least to the Enlightenment, Europeans have imagined kind of this hard border between each individual human and the world around them. This shows up in dualisms like mind and body or subject and object. You can even think about the very word individual. So like to be a proper subject is to have a certain amount of sovereignty and independence, to be static, unitary, and self-interested. Under the Western idea of the nation state, the classical subject is the basic organizing unit for rights and recognition, a citizen who's equal before the law. In a similar way, under market capitalism, the subject is a rational and competitive economic actor, such as a consumer or a producer, a worker or an employer. I want to underline that this particular kind of subjecthood is not only assumed, but actually enforced by these systems. To be a subject of the state or of the market is to be calculable and legible. In their eyes, subjects are not only equal, but interchangeable. So this is a veneer of rational order that's used to legitimate the violence and the structural inequality of the system itself. On a fundamental level, sovereign subjectivity is about property, borders, and exclusion. And those who are excluded are called things like refugee, undocumented, homeless, pirate, prisoner, slave. The argument I'm building toward here is that user is to platform as citizen is to state, and as the idealized rational buyer or seller is to market. And this may seem almost like a trivial analogy, but I think it takes on a little more significance when we remember that although the individual Enlightenment subject has been widely critiqued and contested in those more familiar contexts of the state and the market, for the most part, we remain kind of unable to even conceive of ways of interacting with digital technology beyond this construction of the user. Now, we could spend all day going through some of the critiques of the humanistic subject that have arisen from fields like cultural studies, decolonial studies, feminist or queer theory, post-structuralism. Some of those will come up later on, but one of the key points I want to make is that you don't have to be a French philosopher to see that this way of thinking about ourselves and each other is highly restrictive, and I think even harmful. And that's because intuitively, we all know that selfhood is not given or fixed. It's permeable and dynamically evolving as we move through the world and use the language available to us to try and make sense of our experiences and relationships. So even when we aren't visibly excluded because of race or gender or class or other identities, we're still harmed by these systems. And I think social media is one of them that try to reduce us to the calculable or the legible, or expect us to still be tomorrow exactly who we were today, or pit us against each other in a war of all against all. So what I want to do today is look at how exactly that kind of subjectivity is reproduced by the paradigm of the social media user, and whether or not there might be some cracks in that facade. So when you log on to a platform like Twitter or Facebook, what you see is your own personalized view into those worlds. That view is made up of the people you follow, the stuff they've posted, the notifications that let you know who's interacting with you. But it's inherently kind of this partial and individually situated window into basically a database, right, that would otherwise be an incomprehensible totality. And you can imagine looking down at the same totality from the bird's eye view of the platform itself, or its administrators. So from that perspective, the fact that a post is created over here is completely independent from the fact that you see it in your feed over there. So it's only via the artificially designed subject position of the user that events are organized into a world that can be experienced. When this is the only way that we're ever allowed to see ourselves or each other, that subject position becomes like internalized, and we can feel this happening to us, and we hate it. On the back end, of course, the user exists only as a unique identifier with a bundle of metadata fields, associated in turn with user inputs and other data traces. Social platforms are fundamentally agnostic about who it is that's using them, who's on the other side of the screen. And in this sense, that they are actually ahistorical in their view of the world. So it's not just that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. It's that Facebook doesn't care you're a dog as long as it can still serve you ads. On the front end, the construct of the user is reflected back to us via the user profile. The profile is something between a bumper car and a funhouse mirror, right? So it's both the constant labor of maintaining a public face, as well as the vehicle through which we interact with others. So sovereignty is hard-coded as privacy. Borders come up again here, but it's always already compromised, not by hackers, but by the platform itself, where these profiles are embedded. Visible metrics such as the number of friends or followers we have, the number of likes or shares that we get, become social currency that turns the mere activity of talking to each other into a game with winners and losers. And it's not just about being tied to a real name profile. You can think of Reddit, that's mostly anonymous, but it has the most explicitly gamified social currency system out there. So these subjective experiences, of competitiveness and isolation and alienation from ourselves and each other are the results of particular design choices that cast us in the performative role of the user. So these effects have material and technical origins, but they inevitably make their way into the kinds of culture and sociality that happens on these platforms. What I want to suggest is that all those things we mentioned earlier that make platforms into HELLSITES are downstream from here, right? So a person sharing like a COVID truther article is inherently tied to their labor to construct and maintain a narrative about who they are on this platform in relation to their imagined audience. In other words, humanism as an ideology is what underlies the social media platform, the same way that it underlies institutions like the market and the nation state. So platforms work to reproduce this ideology by forcing us into the ahistorical subject position of the user. Many of us may have heard by now the saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think that it's for the same exact reasons that we find it so hard to dream up a social platform that's not just another Twitter clone. All that being said, the ideological process that I'm describing here is not inevitable, right? And its work on us is always incomplete. If you think about it, tiny subversions are everywhere we look, like the Finsta or Twitter alt, where we take anything that's too edgy for main. Pet pages on Instagram is another recent Theorizing the Web panelist talked about. Facebook groups where college students roleplay as like ants on an ant farm, or even sneaking jokes into anonymous Wikipedia edits. There's a sense of like silliness or even relief here that we feel whenever we step outside of the confines of being strictly ourselves on social media. And I think that this feeling of relief is itself evidence that we experience userhood as unfreedom. At the far end of the spectrum is the figure of the lurker, who withdraws from recognition and refuses to participate altogether. At the same time, many of these examples strike us as kind of not quite kosher, or even as misuse. We think of 4chan as the classic case of anonymity festering into toxic subcultures. This kind of anxiety also creeps up when we think about users that are something other than human, like AI influencers or Russian bot armies, or even the way we talk about the algorithm as if the platform itself is some kind of personalized, capricious deity. I want to kind of lean into that anxiety about the inhuman and see where it takes us. Now, I'm far from the first person who's tried to do this kind of deconstruction of the user. In particular, post-userism is this really great 2017 academic paper by Eric Baumer and Jed Brubaker in Human-Computer Interaction. And they trace the history of the user back to time-sharing in mainframe terminals and show how the idea of the user evolved as computers entered the workplace and then the home. Like me, they're interested in the limitations of the user as a design construct, and they're skeptical of so-called human-centered design as an approach. They even go through some of the same examples I just mentioned. But I think where I would draw a distinction between this paper and my interest here is that their approach is mostly descriptive and solution-oriented. So they talk about scenarios where the user breaks down on its own because of some kind of unanticipated use, and they encourage designers and technologists to better prepare for those cases. In contrast, I'm interested in actively designing situations in which a person's sense of being a single static enlightenment subject is broken down intentionally. So I want to recruit the people previously called users as accomplices in the deconstruction or even the abolition of the material and technical conditions through which userhood is reproduced. I do want to make a brief note also about the title of this talk, Abolish the User. This is a word choice I made in late 2019 when, to be totally transparent, abolition as an anti-racist political program was not quite at the forefront of my mind the way it is today in the wake of the George Floyd protests. That being said, I think there's a deep resonance between the modern prison abolition movement and the writings of Sylvia Wynter, Saidiya Hartman, and others who have shown how the supposedly universal subject of European humanism is in fact entirely structured around the exclusion and dehumanization of Black and colonized people. The answer that they propose is not more recognition, right, or more inclusion, but rather the abolition of the conditions that require those things as a prerequisite for safety and well-being. So applying abolition in this sense to the context of technology, I'm reminded of activists who work to make things like facial recognition or predictive policing banned altogether, rather than merely trying to improve the diversity of the data sets that are used to train those algorithms. At the same time, it's often said that abolition is about presence, not absence. So doing away with harmful institutions is only half the story. The more interesting thing is what that clears room for. And this is where I think the really exciting work is. So one thing I'm excited about is Darius Kazemi's work to adapt Mastodon for small-scale autonomous platforms on the scale of like neighborhoods. Experiments like this are easier and cheaper than you might think, and we need more of them. But too often they just rework the same tired paradigms that we've been living under. So what I want to know instead is, can we design an anti-Facebook or an anti-Twitter? And it goes without saying that we also have to do away with the mindset that values only rapid growth, or disruption, profit margins on behalf of an extractive owner class. In this sense, what I want is not even really a platform, but truly an anti-platform. I want to erase that sharp divide that we have between people currently called users versus the people that are paid to build and maintain what's under the hood, including like gig workers. Embracing the specific historicity of all these participants, rather than claiming to be like agnostic about who they are and neutral about what they want to do on these platforms. I'm inspired by the work of Arturo Escobar, who wrote a book called Designs for the Pluriverse. He draws from what's called the ontological turn in anthropology to envision design paradigms that, in the words of the Zapatistas, allow for a world in which many worlds fit. So instead of being locked inside this like iron cage tied to my login details, I want to be and become alongside others, human and inhuman, using socio-technical systems that are also autonomous zones that operate on a completely different physics from what we're familiar with today. And going back to that image of the lattice and the vine, I want us to imagine different kinds of socio-technical projects, ones that explicitly set out to enable new forms of culture and sociality that simply aren't possible when everything is designed around the assumption of a singular, competitive, static human subject. I want social spaces that are more generous, more playful, more noisy, more opaque to power. I think that this kind of reimagining is an urgent necessity if we want another world or many worlds to be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Our next speaker is Adam Boffa. Adam is a writer and researcher from New Jersey. His work has appeared in publications including Long Reads, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Further, and Hyperallergic. Adam is going to deliver our second talk of the day called Web Theory in a Warming World. Adam, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. That should work, I think, hopefully. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this. I've been an attendee of Theorizing the Web before, so this is like a really cool opportunity. And thank you for all the work to get this going this year, and considering the circumstances, you know, it's obviously a very, very challenging time, so I really appreciate it. I have to admit that the title of this presentation is slightly misleading. I don't have any novel or unique theorizations to offer here. Instead, I just like to try and share a bit of the research that's out there on the possible impacts of climate change on the internet, and maybe offer a few rough ideas about what those impacts might mean for digital life going forward. So tech companies and enthusiasts in the press often like to promote this idea of the world as hyper-connected. Everybody's always online 24/7, all that sort of thing. So just a quick example of this would be some of the ad copy from Twitter and Facebook. Twitter is, you know, what's happening in the world and what people are talking about right now. If it's happening on Twitter, all that sort of stuff. This sort of language is very, very familiar. Before getting into the issue of climate change specifically, I do want to mention that this is a popular view, but this experience with technology is not actually universal. So this type of data I'm about to cite here is always going to be imperfect, but it can give sort of a rough idea, a rough estimate of internet use globally. I actually had a carve out in here about using the term user and how it's sort of a slippery term, but thankfully that's actually been addressed really, really comprehensively already. So I appreciate that. Going second has some benefits here. But with that in mind, given that caveat, this study estimates that there were about 3.4 billion internet users as of 2017, which means that over half of the world's population was not considered a regular user of the internet. So on this map, darker shades of blue represent a higher proportion of internet users within a country, and then paler colors are lower proportions. But even within countries with high rates of internet use, like the US, as we see here, that access is really uneven, which is something that has become much more visible during the pandemic as activities have moved online, in some cases actually making them less accessible. But this idea of everyone always being online remains a popular way to describe the contemporary world, particularly in the popular press and news media. In The Progress of this Storm, Andreas Malm argues that climate change in particular upends this illusion. It does this rapidly through extreme weather events and gradually through changes like extinctions, desertification, and glacial melt. But discussions of digital technology often presume ubiquity of access to high-speed internet and hypothesize a future based on claims made by tech corporations about AI, big data, streaming, all those sorts of things. Even dystopian imaginings of technological development can rely on some of these assumptions. The notion of an omniscient surveillance state, for example, assumes continual, uninterrupted access to huge energy resources and resilient equipment. And while there's obviously a great deal to be concerned about here, I think the specific ways in which this sort of thing will get worse as global warming progresses may be sort of complicated to predict right now. Climate change might challenge the viability of certain technological projects on the local or global scale. This is not to say that the future will necessarily follow the most pessimistic predictions, just that it will be different in ways that are difficult to forecast with certainty. This will mean re-examining what digital technology's environmental impacts are, what role it ought to play in more just futures, and what technological functions and advancements need to be prioritized in situations made more dangerous and precarious by the climate crisis. Tech companies like to present an image of the internet and digital media that's untethered to the physical world. The idea of the cloud is probably the most recognizable one here. But there is a vast physical infrastructure that supports the internet. Nicole Starosielski has done a lot of work on this, in particular on this huge network of undersea cables that's mapped on this slide here. She calls this network of cables the backbone of the global internet. These cables lie at the bottom of the sea and are responsible for transmitting the vast majority of the data that travels across the oceans. That includes internet data, financial transactions, diplomatic transmissions, phone calls, TV broadcasts, all that sort of stuff. And the speed with which they do this gives them a significant advantage over alternatives like satellite. This means that damage to these cables can have devastating consequences. There are a few potential areas of vulnerability that Starosielski discusses. Climate change influences the frequency and strength of storms at sea, which could interrupt the expansion and maintenance of the cable network. And then there are issues at shore too, at the stations along the coasts where undersea cables join with the rest of the physical network. Extreme weather events and flooding can, again, impact repair and upkeep, or impact the power grid that these stations rely on. On land, another infrastructure network comes into play with fiber optic cables, data centers, power stations, and more. A lot of this has been built alongside existing roads and power lines. Much of it is on coastlines. Cables on land are generally not designed for prolonged exposure to seawater, which could lead to complications in the coming years. One recent study projected that by the 2030s, thousands of miles of fiber optic cable could be impacted by rising sea levels and more severe flooding. This is not a map from that study. It's just a projection of what flood zones could look like by 2040 in the area around the Museum of the Moving Image, just for some context. But researchers have claimed that up to 20% of the internet infrastructure of the US could be underwater in scenarios involving just 1 foot of sea level rise. And then there's energy use and emissions. Using the internet requires energy, which as of now means producing carbon emissions. And the greater the amount of data being loaded, the greater the amount of energy, and so the greater the emissions. So here's just a quick example of what that looks like. These charts are from an issue of Parametric Press, which just came out last month, I think. And they show the emissions produced when scrolling through different websites. So we can see that scrolling a Google search result page, which is primarily text-based, produces far fewer emissions than scrolling through something like Facebook, which is more likely to be filled with images and video clips. And then on a similar note, this chart here shows that increases in video quality require more emissions as well. So streaming a 1080p music video produces over 3 times the amount of emissions as streaming a 360p music video. But the web has seen a huge expansion of higher quality multimedia content over the past decade. According to one study, in 2016, YouTube traffic alone produced an amount of carbon equal to the annual emissions of over 2 million cars. Looking beyond YouTube, the internet as a whole currently makes up about 10% of global electricity demand annually. As more people gain access to the internet and online services continue to expand, internet emissions will expand too, potentially producing over 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. This presents some challenges for a society that during the same period will need to rapidly shrink emissions while presumably not denying access to anybody. Kevin Lozano wrote a great piece on this for the New Republic last year, if this is something you'd like to read more up on. So one framework for addressing this is obviously through some combination of more sustainable hardware, like actual physical hardware, and renewable energy sources. Shifting to renewables as soon as possible is necessary, but will require enormous resources. Last year, researchers in the United Kingdom produced a study examining the volume of resources needed to electrify the UK's car fleet by 2050. The study claimed that doing so would require an amount of cobalt equal to nearly 2 times current global annual cobalt production, 75% of global annual lithium production, and half of global copper production. This is among other resources. Separately, scientists with the United States Geological Survey have identified about 24 minerals used in a variety of industrial, consumer, and renewable technology products that could become scarce or more difficult to acquire as demand grows. Now, whether or not those resources actually do become scarce, the point is that the material foundations, there are material foundations beneath any shift away from fossil fuel use. The extraction process for these resources is often grossly exploitative, subjecting workers to dangerous conditions and communities to environmental degradation. And so when hypothesizing a future in which there are significant emission cuts principally through renewable technologies, I think it's important to keep in mind that the extraction and use of these materials really involves political questions of self-determination and sovereignty for the communities involved. I wouldn't want to necessarily assume that the kind of digital experiences made possible by that exploitation today could be entirely replicated with lower emissions if the goal is to transition away from fossil fuels in a just manner. Now, outside of renewables and overhauling internet infrastructure entirely, there are ways to design for a web with lower emissions. Things like shifting away from high quality images and video, prioritizing text, offering different versions of a website depending on local conditions, or cutting advertising, which tends to be really image heavy. This is an example from Low Tech magazine. This is running off of their version of their website that runs off of a solar generator. This is Branch, which launched just a couple weeks ago, I think, and it adjusts its design based on the status of your local energy grid. And so I went to this site, I guess 2 or 3 different days or something like that, and I got 2 different versions of the same page. It's actually the page that explains how they adjust their design based on grid conditions, but you can see the colors are changed between the 2 of them. But these ideas are all kind of running in the exact opposite direction that things on the corporate operated internet have been headed in recent years, with the growth of video streaming platforms, the focus on producing more multimedia content, and the continued reliance on advertising revenue as the primary business model for digital publications. As more of the impacts of climate change manifest, I think some ideas around personal and societal relationships to technology and the internet will be reevaluated. In particular, there's this aspirational perspective on technology and society. The notion that a society, quote unquote, like, achieves progress and fulfills its greatest purpose by expanding its investment in digital technology, especially. This is already a very loaded concept, but climate change, I think, will pose greater obstacles for it going forward. So then what will the internet of the future look like? I think it's tough to say, to be honest. For many people, it may be slower, less reliable, less consistently available. It could certainly reproduce and amplify existing inequalities as companies respond to outages and overstressed infrastructure with even more throttling or more gatekeeping. But there is also the potential for alternatives. Democratized networks that don't depend on data centers and networks owned by conglomerates. These may inhibit the goals of constant connectivity and the migration of services and activities to the internet, but these decentralized networks also may prove to be more resilient and accessible when it counts. And they could allow for the prioritization of critical services when needed most. Regardless, I think things will just be different. I'm not exactly sure how, but I think recognizing the uncertainty here can be a helpful place to start. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Adam. Adam has not even used up all his time. So I would now also like to ask Melanie to join us for the Q&A part. And feel free to both unmute yourselves if you want. So I think it's this is one of those, I guess, not so rare, but maybe really rare panels where the papers don't seem to have a lot in common when you read the abstract, but as you listen to the actual presentations, there's actually quite a lot of overlap. So I think I'll start with maybe with Melanie. And my first question would be, to what extent do you think what we currently have in all the different shapes and sizes of how you can be a user or how you can transform your experience as a user online, how much of that is actually salvageable? And do you see any way in retaining at least some of what we have right now, or do we need to just burn it all down and start from scratch?
I think that the short answer is that I think some systems are just like, I think what I want to do is, like, when you problematize the user, I think that does problematize like the idea of the platform itself as well. Like what a platform is, right, is like a stage with people on it. And I think that is sort of this like inherently Western construction. And I think that what I'm trying to do is just like unpack that whole thing. And I think there are certainly ways to make platforms better, but like that's kind of tinkering around the margins. You see this with a lot of like, efforts that, Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey make to try to like appease the like anti-tech lobby or activist or whatever. But like, it's always, yeah, it's just tinkering around the edges. It doesn't really address the fundamental problems. And I think that even attempts to sort of separate from that kind of, these monolithic, like huge platforms like Twitter, such as Mastodon or other like more small scale autonomous networks, if they use that same logic, it doesn't really solve the problem. You see this with like lots of other attempts to just kind of make something different, make something new. Like I read a great article about Discord recently and how Discord is used for like these small communities. And I think that's really, I think that, stuff like that is important and it goes in the right direction. But I think why that's good and why that's cool is because it sort of gives us a place where we can be together in ways that aren't like gamified, in ways that aren't like the excess like information isn't like vacuumed up and used for advertising. So, I mean, burn it all down and start from scratch is like obviously difficult and probably not likely to happen in the near future. But I think what I do want to do is try to like, if we are going to make something new, how can we make it like actually different?
Yeah, thanks. And I think, yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously, like you touched on, the business model being the problem in your presentation. And so like, it's almost, is there anything we can get the platforms to do apart from, just like disappearing? But Adam, do you think like, is there any way again that, these giants, internet giants, which obviously are implicated, I think, the most in the size of the carbon footprint. Do you think that is there a way we can impose some kind of carbon tax on them or something like that, or do we just need to? Can they invest in, I don't know, wind energy, solar power, or should they just completely rethink their business model and not just how much energy they expend on a daily basis?
That's a really good question. At this point, I'm a little bit skeptical of the ability of like the U.S. government, for example, to like impose something like a carbon tax. It's been in the wings for like, I don't know, 25, 30 years now, and it's never quite come to fruition. So I'm a little skeptical of it. But I do think that means that it offers maybe an opportunity to sort of re-strategize a bit and look at it kind of in exactly the ways that you're discussing, which is both of you are discussing, which is not just an opportunity to sort of decarbonize, but to rethink the entire sort of ownership structure of it. Because I think if you were to shift to a model that's more decentralized, that allows more like user ownership, like ownership in quotes, I suppose, user participation in actually the governance of it, that sort of thing, that would necessarily end up having a smaller carbon footprint, I think. And you could also get into questions of like, well, where do we want our sort of energy to be coming from? What resources do we want to be using? Those sorts of things. That'd be a more democratic participatory sort of process, which would, I think, I feel like would necessarily lead to better outcomes than what we're sort of looking at the moment. But yeah, it is. I think it's a really, really big and difficult question. But I think the ownership structure of the current sort of tech conglomerates is sort of fundamentally in opposition to serious decarbonization, I think.
Yeah, and I think like there's been all these conversations, about platform cooperativism and things like, let's buy Twitter, which, obviously people think that that's a possibility, but it requires quite a lot of effort, and it requires a huge organization and coordination on the part of a lot of people to even attempt something like that, and to get some sort of attempt at controlling even the decisions about design, about new markets, about energy, about all of those things. It's interesting that you both in your talks mentioned this idea, of the alternative kind of shape and ownership of these decentralized, disaggregated networks, very local, very kind of almost off the main grid mesh networks, things like that. I mean, how realistic is this? Like, how can we see this idea and make it kind of, I guess, more mainstream, for lack of a better word? Are there specific barriers to these activities, apart from the fact that, the big platforms are so popular? But like, is it, and are the barriers for building and using these mesh networks, are they infrastructural? Are they skills-based? Are they imagination? You know, like what are the barriers?
I can take a stab at that. I think that part of what's embedded in that question is sort of this growth mindset, right? Where we have to make a platform an alternative that everybody needs to get on, and then all the problems will be solved. And I think that's really the problem, because that growth mindset comes from the same sort of, impossible to sustain growth that, that these platforms are like built on. With any like pitch of a startup, it's like, well, what's your plan for like growing and eventually becoming profitable is kind of like later on down the line. And I think that that whole like way of thinking is sort of the problem. And I think that when we think about success and what success would look like in terms of, making alternatives, the keyword would be plural. Like they need to be like just local, and not just geographically local, but like specific to different use cases, different demographics, different solutions for different problems. I think Discord is already filling this kind of niche for certain types of communities that aren't really, it's not conducive to have them on something like Twitter. You see the same thing happening in like WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups. Like there's this need for like interactivity and sociality that's not, governed by like competitiveness and gamification. And I think that that need can be answered in different ways. I think there are definitely like technological barriers to things like Mastodon, and there are certainly political barriers to things like buying Twitter, but like, yeah, I think the keyword would be looking at plural answers rather than trying to find a solution.
Yeah,
Adam?
I would agree. And I think in particular, as far as like climate change is concerned, I think, unfortunately the answer is that necessity is going to push certain communities to find solutions like that. That's already been the case in certain circumstances, but the piece by Kevin Lozano goes into this a bit, but it looks at like the use of mesh networks after Hurricane Sandy in New York, where there were neighborhoods that were just sort of like for weeks cut off from consistent internet access, but they obviously had needs online that they had to address. And so out of that necessity, there was a sort of resilience that was born because they needed to find ways to, connect to the internet and that sort of stuff. And so I think that some of those sort of, there's going to be maybe some concerns about obviously like skill sets and whether or not there's like going to be able to be a one-to-one parallel of functionality and that sort of thing. But I just think there's unfortunately cases already where those will have to be, there's a sort of prioritization that happens when considering, are we going to be investing our time and resources into a different sort of network or whatever. And I think climate change will certainly present a lot of those circumstances.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, and this also reminds me of the Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria. I think the same situation very much, where it was more of a necessity because there was no choice, because the main thing was down and it wasn't working. We have a question from our Discord channel, which is our back channel, and the question is, I guess more for Adam, but we can spin it out. The question is, how does the carbon consumption of the web compare on the server side versus the client side?
A good question. I don't know if I know the numbers for that offhand. That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. But I would say, I think the nature of it is such that kind of like going back to like what Melanie's talking about in her talk, like there are only so many sort of options available downstream of what the sort of corporate, server side thing is doing. So even if somebody were to want to mitigate their impacts, if that is, I'm not sure, maybe that's not where the question is going, but if that is a sort of concern, if that's something that we're thinking about, the options are unfortunately limited on a person by person basis, because as much as we might want to bring down our footprint through like what we're viewing or watching or whatever, nobody on the other end is investing that thoroughly into it. But that's a great question. I honestly don't know the answer offhand, but I can look into it and see if I can get up a resource I can share later on. Yeah.
Super. Yeah, that might be a question to explore in your next Theorizing the Web talk. Again, I think to follow up on this a little, and to try and maybe engage in some kind of speculative thinking about possible multiple futures. Do you think there is a future where, you know, we could be living in a place where we have multiple internets? I mean, we already kind of do because of the balkanization and national internets, but in a sense where, you know, we go to the main kind of old web for things like banking or, you know, whatever it is. But there are also those offshoots where we can be whoever we want to be. And, you know, that maybe where in the year, you know, 2050, we have a conference that's called Theorizing the Webs and not Theorizing the Web. Do you think that's possible?
Totally. I think that sounds cool. And I think it would be better than what we have now. I think, you know, there's so much fear mongering about like balkanization of the internet. And so much of that comes from this sort of, like, I hate to use the word, but like neoliberal idea of what it means when like everybody in the world can come together in one place and hash out their differences. And I think the reality is like people have different needs, different cultures, and like that's okay. And I think, you know, having the old internet still exist is great. But I think there's some freedom that comes from starting from scratch in a way, you know, not just like technically and economically, but like philosophically, like what is the actual mindset we bring to like what it is that we want to build.
Yeah, and I suspect it might actually be easier for the people who are still non-users or sometimes users, because obviously their lives aren't already kind of taken over by, you know, this dominant imaginary of what it's like to be an internet user. And in fact, it might actually be easier to bring to them this idea that, yeah, variety is fine. Like it's fine to log into, you know, the green internet today, if you need to conserve energy, and then maybe go and be, you know, the dog internet or whatever, the cat internet tomorrow, if you want. Adam, how do we deal with all of those people on the map that are not connected? What's your outlook for them? How do we get them to join the multiverse?
I mean, there have been cases where, you know, some of the big multinationals have tried to like roll out like solutions, quote unquote solutions to that sort of thing. I think maybe the most infamous one was when Facebook tried to roll out a platform in India where like but it was like, I think it was like giving out cell phones, but they only had Facebook installed. And so like, if you use the internet on the phone, it was exclusively through Facebook. I think
yeah,
the proposal was
Facebook Basics, I think it was called.
Right, exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I believe it was rejected, which seems like the proper response. But I mean, so I think that whatever that is not that would be a good way to do it, I think is like whatever would grant sort of autonomy in the decision-making process of, you know, allowing whatever the size and scope of the community is to determine for itself what it seems to be the most relevant to it, both like sort of socially, culturally, economically, whatever, but then also physically, depending on where it is actually physically located, because that might end up being a different use case, you know, which at the moment is sort of disregarded because the assumption is there's always going to be, you can pipe it in from somewhere. But, you know, those are very, very difficult questions. And I think the top-down approach is going to become increasingly difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I would actually tie that in also to the audience question we had. Like, I think that the reality about, I would say all of these platforms is that they are massively complicated, you know, because there's so much cruft that's built on to monetize them and to make them, you know, streamlined. And when you look at something that's more bare bones, like oftentimes, like think about like the old school, like bulletin boards, or like it doesn't need to be complicated to be a space where people can come together and have fun and have community. And I think that when we start to rethink what it means to like what a platform is and what is like something that's not even really, you know, can be called a platform, that does, I think, I would say necessarily like reduce the amount of just extra bullshit that like takes up so much energy and resources. So I think that they're definitely tied together in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually a really nice note on which to wrap up, because, you know, the future can be multiple. It doesn't have to necessarily be complicated, but it can still be fun and also help save the planet. So on that note, I'd really like to thank both of our panelists, Melanie and Adam, for their contributions. And I'd like to remind you that we still have one more Theorizing the Web Presents that's going to happen on December 2nd. The topic of our next Theorizing the Web Presents is going to be, ooh, two more, sorry Whitney. Yes, that's correct, December 2nd, and then there's one other in December. And then 2020 is going to come to an end, thankfully. So the topic of our next Theorizing the Web Presents on December 2nd is going to be Age Against the Machine. And we'll let you speculate about what the talks will actually be about, but you will also be able to find that out fairly quickly by going to our website, theorizingtheweb.org. And again, I'd like to thank the Museum of the Moving Image for hosting and producing Theorizing the Web Presents, and to thank the people running Theorizing the Web, and also all of our community members online, offline, and in the multiverse. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you.